overeating or suicidal ideation or self-harming isn't because you're defective. It didn't arise because you're defective. It arose because you're adaptive. And that's wonderful. It saved your life. Let's regard that.
Discovering who you really are can be the most exciting adventure of your life if you have the courage to look deep within, face your fears, and overcome your self-limiting beliefs. Welcome to the most exciting adventure of your life. Welcome to a new way of living. Welcome to the Fierce Planet Adventures podcast.
Hi, I'm Casey.
And I'm Andy, and we're on a mission to inspire and guide 1 million people to live a life of purpose, passion, and self-mastery, leveraging the 5 mountains of cutting-edge human development to build extreme mental fitness. Friends, suffering is part of life, and trauma is all too common. Although no one talks about it, leaving many to feel alone, ashamed, and disqualified from living a good life, some cultures believe suffering is actually a rite of passage, a way to rise. Become greater than your circumstances. Resolve to rise above your trauma.
Today's guest is a Fortune 5 healthcare executive and licensed counselor, a dedicated champion of patient-centered solutions within the healthcare industry. She has spoken to crowds of thousands about the patient experience and has been featured by Open Minds, Mental Health America, and the National Association of State Mental Health Programs Directors. In addition to her corporate experience, she worked with clients in clinical practice for nearly 20 years and is a certified in trauma. There's a lot to say for studied and proven approaches, but she takes it one step further with her lived experience and success in cultivating approaches to draw out the very best in herself and others. Through her signature combination of intellect, insight, experience, and compassion, Lilli Correll offers powerful lessons that can help anyone rise above their circumstances and create their own unlimited success. Her expertise in healthcare, from payer to provider, has uniquely positioned her to move beyond helping individuals to transforming the healthcare system. Welcome, Lilli.
Thank you.
Very welcome. Excited to have you here. And we like to start the calls off by asking what you're most excited about in your life right now.
I'm probably a little slow to the game, but I'm probably most excited about going on a trip somewhere vacation oriented. I have gone out to see my daughter in Baltimore, but I think it's time to go to Italy or do something really crazy and drink fabulous wine and take in the scenery.
That sounds like an amazing adventure. So, Lilli, tell us about yourself. What motivated you to begin helping people with trauma?
As I worked through my own trauma and my own lived experience, I realized that oftentimes I felt like I was alone. I felt like I was irreparably damaged because I was going to counseling, I was talking about what was going on, and I still got triggered. I still would get these sweeping emotions that would come up, and anxiety and stress over things that didn't seem like they should cause that kind of reaction. And I've learned through my own journey that what I feel is oftentimes not that unique. A lot of times, whatever I'm feeling, other people are feeling. And so as I started to make inroads with my own healing, I thought, there's got to be a lot of people out there that are feeling that same way, that they're irreparably damaged, that their trauma is somehow uniquely awful, or it has impacted them in a uniquely awful way, and they can't live a fulfilling or rewarding life, or have healthy relationships, or really claim the very best that life has to offer. And so I've known, honestly, it seems a little bit weird, but since I was 16 years old, I knew that God was going to use my story to bless other people. I had this song with God. I don't know if you guys will be familiar with it. And I always think I'm really young still, but Anne Murray wrote a song called You Needed Me. And in that song, she said, I cried a tear, you wiped it dry. I was confused, you cleared my mind. I sold my soul, you bought it back for me. You needed me. And she talks about how she takes you in this journey of, and I believe God or the divine lifting you out of your circumstances because you're needed. And I really knew at that point that there would come a time where I would basically deliver on that I would give other people hope that I had been given.
Wow, that's powerful. And yes, I do remember the song.
Thanks. Yay.
So I kind of want to walk people through a kind of a process here, or at least a pathway. When we talk about trauma, I think it's helpful for people to understand, what trauma is, and there's different types of trauma or events that can trigger or cause trauma. Would you mind talking about a few or some of those type of triggers or events?
Absolutely. And I think this is a really important question because each one of us experiences circumstances, whether they're traumatic or not, differently. We filter it through based on our own personal history, our experiences, our personalities, just, how we navigate through that is unique. And so not only are there circumstances that can happen that can be traumatizing for a person, but there's also a sense that whatever that circumstance is, so whether it be physical abuse, whether it be emotional abuse, we hear the term gaslighting, where somebody's convincing you somehow in this kind of sneaky kind of way that you're crazy. Or if it's sexual abuse, any kind of abuse like that, we know typically, that makes sense. That's traumatizing. Or I was thinking about like traumatic events at one point, because obviously I've been studying this quite a bit. And I remembered that I was driving home one day and I actually saw a pedestrian fatality accident on the highway. That was very traumatic for me. The idea is that a traumatic event is traumatic, or abuse or whatever circumstance is traumatic when you don't have the ability to deal with the emotional impact, to integrate that response and to work through it. So your body is on overwhelm and you are kind of in that fight or flight. In that circumstance, when I was driving home, I pulled off the road. And I think I was the only one who realized that it was a person these people were driving over. And I will stop sharing too much more because I don't want to traumatize the listeners. But I pulled over, and immediately, after an accident or something like that, that's when you fall apart. You're like completely composed. I pulled over and I start hyperventilating, and I'm calling the police, and the woman's saying, you need to pull your car over. Of course I was pulled over. But it's just that sense of complete overwhelm that you're not able to navigate, and you feel like there's a risk and in that instance, I'd witnessed a fatality, but there's a risk of death to somebody, either yourself or somebody else. And sometimes that risk is perceived, right? If you're a child and you're suffering violent abuse, your life may not be at risk, but you perceive that your life is at risk, or your sibling's life is at risk. And that is traumatic. And that creates that fight or flight response. I think another important part of kind of clarification is there's incidents where you have one incident. Like if all that ever happened to me was I drove home one day and I saw this accident, then it's a lot easier to kind of work through that traumatic event. If you have repetitive abuse, you're in an abusive relationship, or you grow up in child abuse, they've actually found out that your brain changes. And so now you have an email, or you visually see something, or you hear something, or you smell a scent, and it reminds you of that trauma. And all of a sudden you're in your, what they call a basement brain, and not able to problem solve. And you're in that fight or flight and feeling like I'm crazy because I'm responding in this crazy way to something that's not a big deal.
You touched on it a little from your own experience, but how do some of these traumas manifest in our day-to-day lives?
And this is one of those things where it can be so many things that if, as you're reading through the list, at some point I had to stop myself because there's about 1 million ways that this can kind of manifest, unfortunately. But I think the most common manifestation of trauma is dissociation. And it can be as mild as you're driving home from work, you get home and you do not remember driving home at all. There's actually an expression for that. That's way on the bottom end, right? That's the least dissociative, all the way up to having conversations, having experiences, and not being able to recall them. So it makes sense, right? That if you're experiencing trauma, you might check out, right? Because reality is too overwhelming. So I'm checking out. And what happens is you cannot just check out and then check back in. And then check out when it's, and then check back in. You end up just kind of checking out. Anytime there's any distress at all, you might find that you're not in the game. I know for me, my spouse would be saying, Lilli. And then I'm like, what? Missed a whole conversation. Or later on, I told you I was going to do this. And I'm like, oh, shoot, I'm so sorry. I don't remember. That you lose information. And sometimes just really inconsequential information. Some individuals with trauma will say they remember some things with crystal clarity, and then other things that seem like no big deal, they don't remember at all. And they're not sure what that's about. So dissociation is really, really common. Most people create coping strategies, and depending on your abuse, that will determine kind of what kind of coping strategies that you will adapt to. I think it's really interesting, as I've been recently going through another trauma training. It was talking about kind of fight, flight, freeze, and flee. And it was breaking it out based on this psychological approach into parts. And it was associating behaviors with the parts. So for instance, fight would be associated with anger or suicidality.
Oh, wow.
So it just really, really, so you might see self-harming behaviors. You might see, other types of things that are like, that's the fight response. And I thought that was just really, really fascinating. I think that oftentimes people will have issues with sleep. They might have flashbacks of memories, but they also may have emotional flashbacks. And that's important to understand. Again, you're in a situation and, Casey says something to you and it's like, you're just, and once you can identify that that's a triggered emotion, that actually what Casey said isn't that upsetting, but what she said triggered something that is really upsetting. And that got kind of brought into the conversation. And so now you're just so upset that actually is a trauma response, that those bringing in those bigger emotions into situations that don't quite fit the situation. And it could be shame, it could be anger, it could be hypervigilance or fear or any number of different emotions. But you can have an emotional trigger, you can have a physical trigger in your body where you feel things. If you were, had abuse, you might feel like you're reliving it. And you can have all kinds of different ways that kind of manifests. And people will sometimes, if it's very, very distressing, will start doing things to kind of cope with that, like self-harming behaviors or alcohol, substance abuse, marijuana. And, you'll start seeing that person is, or making suicide threats, that person is continuing to do that. So I think hopefully we'll get to this later, but I want to talk about kind of some of those adaptive strategies that people come up with that are very destructive later on, but maybe save their life during it, right? If I am going through a horrible event and I shut down, that might protect me psychologically. If I grow into an adult and I'm in a relationship and I shut down and I'm not present, that's going to be damaging to the relationship. So,
right.
But there's a lot of different ways. I want to make sure I cover off on some gastrointestinal issues. So when triggered, you might, have an upset stomach, headaches, difficulty sleeping, sometimes under eating. So a lot of eating issues, restricting, but you may also overeat. Some people will say, I like to eat my comfort food to kind of, that doesn't mean they had trauma, but I'm just saying that sometimes, because a lot of these behaviors actually are things we think of when we have stress. And then you just take that and you just blow it up. And that's what you're going to see as a reaction to trauma.
Do you think, or in your experience, do a lot of people just overlook the trauma idea and assume they're just stressed out?
It's a really great question. I think we're getting better at identifying trauma. That being said, since I wrote my book and put it out in the world, I've had several people say either that they were going to start dealing with their trauma, so it was like a recognized thing, or that they started wondering, did I have trauma? And I'm certainly not trying to create trauma that
right.
But I do think, generationally, each generation has gotten a little bit more emotionally connected, a little bit more attentive to people's feelings and things like that. I mean, my son, who's 29, came home one day from daycare and said that some little boy told him that boys don't cry. And I think that kind of mentality, it's just like us feeling like you have to keep a stiff upper lip and press on, and that sometimes that is keeping people from dealing with and going through so they can come out on the other side, more alive, really, and connected, because they feel like they need to be strong and tough.
When I think about energy and vitality, I think about a kid. They have the energy to play, run around, climb things. That energy that feels like you just can't contain yourself. It's the stuff we've always wished they could just bottle up and sell to us, right? Well, this company's found a way to do just that. Amari's Happy Juice Pack. Mood, motivation, energy, things our bodies can naturally produce when both our guts and our brains are happy and communicating. And we can actually improve that process of communication across the axis of the gut and the brain. This is cutting-edge science. This is game-changing information. This is where science meets soul. This is Amari, and we're helping people feel better naturally. Boost your serotonin and GABA. Balance your neurotransmitters. Nourish your gut. The things that make you want to do. Start feeling better the natural way. Check out the links in the show notes for discounts and more information.
Yeah, that is the goal, or at least I think it should be the goal, is to come out, to deal with it, process it, and move through it so you have more energy to show up in the world in a very positive, supportive, and world-centric fashion, or world-centric way. You had touched on a little bit, some of the unhealthy coping mechanisms. Did you have more to share there with the coping mechanisms?
I do. What I wanted to talk about was, we have a tendency to very dismissively, or maybe just not taking it as seriously as we should, to say to people, just basically don't be suicidal, or don't overeat, just get on a diet, or you'll feel better if you go for a walk, or any number of things like that. Right. And so it's important to understand, and I say this in my book, right? It's not overeating or suicidal ideation or self-harming isn't because you're defective. It didn't arise because you're defective. It arose because you're adaptive. And that's wonderful. It saved your life. Let's regard that for a second, right? And then one of the questions that Janina Fisher posed when I was going through her training was, if suicide is the answer, what is the problem? Wow.
Yeah.
I was like, that's a really different way to look at suicidality, is to say, if that's a solution, yeah, that's a solution, right? Let's take a moment to understand what it's solving. Let's take a moment to understand that it is solving something. and that it's been used for you to survive. And then you can start talking about, well, what other things could I do that would be more adaptive to fit that need? But first you have to regard it, and you can't just take it away, right? You can't just tell somebody, stop restricting your food, when restricting their food is what helped them feel like things were consistent and in their control. Well, then you first have to help them navigate, how do I get a sense of that control in other ways? And really build that out before you take that from them, right? They need to be able to feel like, I can safely move from this adaptive strategy that's potentially going to kill me to this adaptive strategy that's going to help me heal.
Yeah. And this could also be an automatized reaction as well. So we may not even be conscious to the fact that we're doing it.
Correct.
Yeah.
I suspect that it's not switching from one to another, one more healthy. It takes time, right? It's not just necessarily a one-shot deal. It's a process. Is that true?
It would be really, I wouldn't have written a book if it was a one-stop deal.
Yeah.
I really wish it was.
Well,
It'd be nice.
Right,
know,
right,
really
exactly. In our society, I think that, we've become so comfortable with the pill that solves this, or the one hack that solves that. And in the coaching world, in our coaching experience, this, and we don't do therapy, right? We do coaching, but it's a process, and it takes, it's not just a 1 week or a 1 month thing. It can take a long time. But on the other side of that is so much more peace and clarity and understanding of yourself and how you can be, how you can move through the world.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, it makes me think of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. She put this out there. It was genius. I think she's right. Like, these are the stages, and I think she should have put them in bullet points and then created some kind of circle or zigzag or something, because I think we all kind of digested it the same way. And we said, okay, I'm on stage 4. I'm almost done. I'm about to tap out of grief and move on to joy, and I'm good. And then you drive down the street and you pass the convenience store, which is the last place you got gas with your spouse who passed away. And you're like a puddle on the floor. And you're like, how did this happen? I'm on stage 4. How does this happen? And so it's really having regard, not just for each other, but having regard for yourself, in understanding that what you are navigating is difficult, and it does come in layers, and there are things that are going to remind you, and feelings may arise. And if they do, that's okay. They're just feelings. They're not going to take you down, as long as you don't try to resist them, which is, I think, often that's what causes suffering, right? Is resisting, is trying to manhandle or woman handle, who knows, a situation to the ground, and not just say, okay, this is where I am. I feel sad, or I feel ashamed, and really leaning into that and letting it be, so that we can move again through it, rather than letting it take charge of our lives and kind of derail us. But yeah, I think I'm going to spend the rest of my life, honestly, on this trek, getting a little bit more adept and a little bit less triggered, and a little bit more fulfilled and joyful, and easier at leaning into the difficult feelings and situations. But they're not going to stop happening.
Right.
So I totally agree with that.
So I want to change maybe the course a little bit and just ask some questions about different trauma. Not sure which word to use here. I'll just say, can trauma be epigenetic?
Absolutely. Generational. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
It's really honestly very fascinating. If you start talking to someone about what is their core complaint, and Bert Ellinger is the perfect person if you ever want to learn more about epigenetics to read. But if they come in and they have a core complaint, and sometimes you really have to dig deep to get to what is that real core complaint about what's going on. I'm afraid everybody's going to reject me. Well, what happens? What's your greatest fear if everybody rejects you? Well, that I'll be alone. Well, what's your greatest fear? That you'll be alone, that my needs won't be taken care of, whatever. And you get to this kind of core space, right? That as you start building out the genogram of characteristics of your mother, characteristics of your father, characteristics of your mother's parents, as she would describe them, her characteristics, as your dad would describe his parents, their characteristics, it is crazy how much sense it all makes that you are in this place of going, oh, this is why this is my core complaint. So for me, just as an example, with my mom, I had what they call a break in the bond, right, with my mom, because I was afraid of her. And there's this sense of from Bert Ellinger's work about how love is supposed to flow. It should flow from parent to child and then child to their child, right? Mm-hmm. But oftentimes when you're in a traumatic circumstance, the love is flowing up, right? I'm taking care of mom. I'm trying to make sure mom is okay so that we don't get hurt. I'm trying to take care of her emotionally. I'm trying to make sure that everything stays calm. And that when that reverse order starts happening, kind of how that manifests then when I have children, now my children have to take care of me. I'm not able to erect boundaries for myself because I have to take care of my mom and make sure she's okay. And I have to keep everything calm, but I'm a person and I need things. So people have to read my mind. And then my children have to create the boundaries by, doing crazy, insane things. Like I cleaned my room on my own because I just thought I should, as a teenager. Mm-hmm. And if they don't, feeling like it's an affront to me, right? And I'm sure you've seen this, right? Like where the mom is so wounded. And so if I'm wounded with my child, the love is not going in the right order. Hmm. So it's fascinating how that stuff just keeps flowing. The other thing is, which I thought was fascinating, was back during 9/11, there were some pregnant women who were in New York City, and they actually assessed them apparently years later. And they found that not only did the moms have the stress hormones with trauma stress hormones, but the babies who had not yet been born had those.
Wow.
So it's very interesting. The other thing I'll say is that the women, when they're in their mother's womb, have all the eggs that produce their children later on. So you've got that generational kind of thing with your mom. So it's just, there's been so much research in that area, and also just being able to see that both environmentally and epigenetically, what manifests when certain dynamics occur, dad left mom raised son becomes overly connected to mom, and how the things start manifesting, and then who's attracted to this gentleman based on their own. Mm-hmm. It's really, really great. And I love the epigenetic work because it brings in the body and the somatic experiencing of sitting with, then understanding the core language that goes along with that, and undoing it, giving back to mom or dad their fate. Mm-hmm. I'm over here and you're over there. Your feelings are over there and my feelings are over here. And being able to do some meditative work to really connect in the body, what's going on in the body, and starting to erect some boundaries to reframe the flow of love, so that maybe mom isn't physically there because she's not safe to be around, or maybe she's deceased, but that I'm reworking that in my meditation of reframing that language. If mom's alive, I can start talking to mom in different ways. Mom says, "You're my best friend," or "You're my savior," in my instance. And I could say, "Mom, that's crazy. I'm not your savior. I'm your daughter." Okay. And that reorders that. So I love the epigenetic work. I think it's really powerful.
Wow, that it is. Thank you. Um, Casey?
So much there. I guess what came up is, where does trauma bonding fit into all this?
So, as I understand it, you might be in a situation where you've gone through something traumatic and somebody kind of enters stage left, stage right into your life. And you kind of, this is a kind of a strong word, but glom onto them. And they bring a sense of comfort in the midst of that trauma. And so maybe they're not somebody you would have ordinarily been in a relationship with, but because of the proximity to you during the traumatic event, they get overly, they become overly important to you.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so you develop this kind of bond with them that may not be healthy. Who knows?
Yeah.
Yeah. Curious, do you have a sense of like the opposite, where, for example, in the news today, we hear so much of the negative. It's mostly negative, and there's some very terrible things that happen that the news tells us about or presents to us. When someone takes that information and grabs onto it and kind of spirals down, is there a term for that, or what's the science or psychology behind that?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Yeah. So if you flip it, instead of trauma bonding, it's a human will watch the news and really take on the trauma of the event that they're seeing on the news and spiral.
Yeah. I think we're exposed to so much in the news. And I think that we're probably all a little bit dissociative from that standpoint of like, because I've been sitting here, during COVID and the news gets turned on and I'm like, why are we watching? It's horrible. It's like 17 deaths. And then there was car accidents. There's more car accidents now, and more people are addicted, and sexual abuse. Everyone's doing it. And I mean, it's just like, oh my gosh, like,
Yeah.
And I think that, I think about, like, in solution focused therapy, what you focus on expands. So if I'm focusing on the negative expands. And you can certainly become overly swept up in the drama, and the drama feels kind of titillating and exciting because it's like interesting. We all slow down. We all do it when there's a car accident, and we're not just doing it to respect the fact that there are injured people. We're curious. We want to know, like, this is how Jerry Springer made a living.
Yes.
I think that what we don't appreciate is, and I think this is what you're hitting on, is the impact of that consumption of that kind of negativity and how it feeds kind of our fears. And we used to make a joke, actually. I was like, how is it that, like, at 25, all of a sudden I'm terrified of riding on a gondola, or I'm terrified of heights. And I'm considering all these awful things that could happen, right? Like, as I'm riding over the amusement park, I'm like, oh my God, is this stable? And then it goes click, click, or whatever over the thing. And I'm like, oh my God, we're going to die. And so I said, why am I more afraid? And my friend said, I think it's CNN. We didn't have that when we were children.
Yeah.
Those listeners who are younger than us, they've always had it, but we didn't have it when we were younger.
Right.
We weren't constantly consuming all of this stuff. And so the observation of possibilities of things that could go wrong is just endless. And it could, in fact, create a situation where a person is more hypervigilant or fearful about kind of traversing life because of just consuming too much of that, like 9/11. I mean, sadly, I have to admit that I did sit in front of my TV and watch the towers fall like 7,000 times.
It was hard not to, right? Same here. And it was an event that, that will stick with us forever. And, I think what happened post 9/11 with, if you see something, say something, and, just the whole environment of where the country went was, I think, in some ways, scary and, creates fear. But on the other hand, what I did see positively out of that event was, at least for a time, everybody I came in contact with was just so much more friendly and open and willing to help out. And it's something I think we need to get back to as a country, as a planet. Anyway, I digress.
I don't think you're digressing at all. I think that's absolutely more compassionate, more regard for each other, right? Like just we're all human.
Mm-hmm. This episode of Fierce Planet Adventures podcast is brought to you by 5 Mountain Coaching, licensed unbeatable mind coaching, integrated accelerated vertical growth across 5 domains of cutting-edge development designed by retired Navy SEAL Commander Mark Devine. Learn the Big 4 skills of mental toughness and resiliency. Discover the 6 pillars of performance. Test your mettle with custom-created crucibles across all 5 domains. Visit 5mountaincoaching.com to schedule your free 1-hour unbeatable mind coaching session. That's the number 5, mountaincoaching.com. Begin your journey to becoming unbeatable today. So one more term, and I want to get your thoughts on this. The trauma-informed care, and what is it? And it's a term I think that people have heard a lot more coming up, but maybe don't really understand what it means.
I have thoughts about that word, and that's yeah. I mean, those words, first of all, it's conceptually great. Mm-hmm. I will say there are lots of providers out there that say they're trauma informed, and I promise you they are not. So okay. It's easy to say trauma informed care and not deliver on that. The idea is that if you have suffered from trauma, then your rights were disregarded. Something was imposed on you mm-hmm. that was not of your choosing. And the idea of trauma-informed care is to put you back in the driver's seat of your life. Great, right? Mm-hmm. Great. That makes sense. That's wonderful. How that should manifest clinically is that I go in to see a provider, and the provider is not talking at me. They're talking with me. That a case management program isn't targeting individuals and managing them. A case management program is identifying individuals and supporting them. That there's a understanding that the person who has suffered the trauma has a lived experience. They have an embodiment. They are the experts on what's going on with them. Mm-hmm. And that they should be shown regard and included in the decision-making of their treatment so that nothing is done without their consent. That's how trauma-informed care should be. Unfortunately, you will see some providers who do it beautifully. So I don't want to say, oh, it's all crap and nobody's doing it. It's just to say that there's other providers who say that they do it, and you still go in there and you feel a very hierarchical, one-down relationship with your provider. They're telling you how healing happens. They're telling you how the problem gets solved. And you may think that doesn't feel right. That doesn't sit right for me. Like, I don't think that is my problem. And the provider continues on course with, this is the problem. And it's really a matter of you understanding that this is the problem so that we can work on it. If therapy is not working, it's your fault, right? It's not my fault. In a trauma-informed care arena, it's not even about fault, right? It's about engaging with somebody on their journey with them. And so I love trauma-informed care. I think it's a wonderful thing. I don't think we've done as well. And now it's become a little bit cliche, if you will. Lots of people are using it. Some are doing it, some are not. How does a person know what to expect in that engagement to say, is it trauma-informed? Is it not trauma-informed? I would just say, if you go in and you're seeing somebody and you don't feel regarded, leave and find somebody else because you should be regarded regardless. Even if you're a hot mess and you are screwing things up left and right, maybe even more because of that, you should be regarded. Trauma is not easy to navigate. It's scary. It's painful. It can be damaging. You can get stuck in cycles, right, of repeating the same thing over and over again. Then you get in a relationship and it's traumatic because you're going to the same behaviors that you're used to. It's a mess. It's messy, but you're going to be overwhelmed with shame likely anyway. You don't need a provider who wants to contribute to that.
Yeah.
So like I said, I could go on for days about that, but it is a good thing. I would like to create something that has to do with synergy, right? So you come to me, you see me, Andy, and you are the expert on Andy. You know exactly what you feel in your body, what you think, how you feel when you get triggered. You may not even understand that they're triggers yet, but you know how you feel. You know what you think the problem is. You know what happened to you. You know what you think the solution is. That's really important. You're an expert on that. I am an expert in trauma. I'm a clinician. I have training. I understand the evidence, right? And that's part of the picture, but that is not the whole picture. So I would really love for us to move to a place of having synergy, of understanding that you're an expert and I'm an expert. How do we put that together to create something much bigger and better than either one of us could have created on our own?
Yeah, co-creation. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
It's very powerful.
Absolutely.
I'm sure you're doing that in your coaching. I mean, coaching is all about that, right? Coming alongside, pushing for sure, like pointing things out, pushing people, nudging them.
Right.
Exactly. Nothing against anyone's will.
Right. 100%.
So now that we've talked about different types of trauma, how it manifests, how do we go about trying to rise above it?
It's so funny because when I was writing the book, I was obviously trying to take concepts and ideas and I was trying to start formulating them into frameworks. And one of the frameworks I came up with was this framework, GRACE, which I said, GRACE stands for give, respect, acceptance, and compassion every day. And what that looks like is to give first to yourself, right? That oxygen that we know you get on the airplane and they're like, if we lose cabin pressure, mask is going to drop. And every mom on this plane is going to want to give it to her child first. But if she's unconscious, it's not really going to be very helpful. And so you have to give it to yourself. And so giving first to yourself, what are the things that I can do for myself? It may be therapy. It could be taking a walk. It could be meditating. It could be meeting with my coach, any number of things that give first to me to take care of myself so that I can go out and be my best self. Respect is all about like hard things are hard. They're hard. So give yourself a break, man. If you're not acting like you normally do, that's because you're going through a hard time. Viktor Frankl said, after being in a concentration camp, the normal, and I have to say this slowly because it's kind of a lot to digest, but the normal reaction to an abnormal situation is abnormal. If you act like you normally do when the shit is hitting the fan, then you, my dear, need therapy more than anyone else. The A for acceptance is about giving that acceptance, right, of the situation and being able to kind of sit in it. And so I like to meditate. I don't know if I like to meditate, but it helps me.
Right.
My brain is like on fire. I'm sure you're surprised. Compassion, right, kind of self-explanatory, but I think oftentimes most of us are nicer to other people than we are to ourselves.
Yes.
Like watching our internal dialogue, watching our language, watching what we're focusing on. And then every day is new. Every single day. Don't take yesterday with you. Make it new and start over again. Giving yourself that respect, acceptance, compassion every day. And that has been honestly something that I've gone back to multiple times as I've been going through stressful situations. I'm like, oh my gosh, this works. And so I think we have to start there because shame, I believe, is the inevitable stuck point.
Yeah.
So we got to start with grace, and then we have to go through it. We can't go around it. Unfortunately, we can't go under it. I tell a story in my book about my husband dying, and thank God there was this woman who I only known her for a short time, but she took me back into the room. She had me change the sheets on the bed, go through this whole process. And I really, truly believe that's why I was able to come out the other side as well as I did. We have to go through it. We do. You can't have significant trauma and have all these triggers. Now, what does that mean going through it?
Mm-hmm.
It does not mean that you need to dredge up all of the memories from the past and deep dive into the memory. No, that could make you more traumatized. So that's not what it's about. It's about understanding, how is it showing up today, right? What's going on today that is disruptive to my life? When I get triggered, I feel this way. Understanding that, oh, when I start feeling this way, I'm being triggered. This is a triggered emotion. This is a triggered emotion. Separating, right, the triggering content from the current situation and starting to do the healing. So know that if you go to a therapist and you say, I want to work on my trauma, and they say, okay, you're going to have to talk it through, leave. But talking about the triggers, and as you talk about the triggers and you start doing deep dives into, what's going on with you, and you remember things, then you work through that content, right? You don't avoid that. You don't run for the hills, because it's like, no, I'm not going to deal with that, because that is in essence in the driver's seat in your life. So I think it's important to go through it. And I'm sure that you guys appreciate this, but the whole mountain climbing, and you know more about it, I know you do, than I do, because I don't know really anything except for that there's a base camp. You go up, you go down, you go up, you go down, you go up, and you go down. And I love that metaphor for understanding that sometimes you have to go backwards to go forwards. And that's why, like, the grace piece, it's like when Sharon Salzberg, and again, I referenced her in my books, I love her meditation, says that when you realize your mind has wandered during the meditation, that's when you have a chance to be really different, right? So our tendency is to go, oh my gosh, I failed, I'm making a grocery list, shoot. But really, when you realize you're making a grocery list is when you have the opportunity to show up really differently. That is worth celebrating, not giving yourself a hard time about. So I think, again, sometimes we got to go backwards to go forwards. That's good. That's progress. It's still progress, right? Like as climbers, right? Aren't you making progress when you go back to base camp?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I think that's really, really important. And then just knowing it's a continual process. It's going to get better, but there are going to be days that really, really suck. And that's okay to be really upset about that.
What, something you said, I want to maybe go just a little bit deeper on that, is what does it look like to have compassion for yourself, or to have self-compassion? You give us a couple ideas there, allowing the space, but walk us through an example. What does that look like? What are some ways to the person can have self-compassion?
Yeah, I think that idea of, like, Viktor Frankl saying that the normal response to abnormal is abnormal. However, when we're going through a hard time, I'm guilty of this myself, and we're feeling upset and anxious and we're not functioning really well, we have a tendency to put pressure on ourselves, right? To say, again, that stiff upper lip, push through. Yeah. You got this. What's your problem? Those are the things that we would say to ourselves, right? That, what's your problem? Why are you're such a wimp, or you need to be tougher, or whatever. And I think being more compassionate is, first of all, recognizing that, right? Because again, the first step is recognizing it, because how do you stop it if you don't know you're doing it? Right. Having this awareness of, wow, I am like maliciously abusing myself. Like if I were saying these things to people at work, I'd be fired. And so first recognizing that when I'm going through a hard time, which is, I tend to, when I'm under stress, I give myself a harder time. I actually took a personality test. It told me, yeah, when you're 100%. Under stress, I equate that to kicking a person while they're down, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So compassion is about saying, I feel shame. That makes sense. This is really bringing up a lot of feelings about XYZ. The other thing is, I loved this. Be curious instead of furious.
Yeah.
We tend to put it on ourselves, right? The anger on ourselves.
Right.
But to stop and to be curious, I'm feeling shaky. I'm feeling worked up. Take some breaths. I'm scared. I'm scared something's going to happen to my relationship, or that I'm going to lose my car or my house, or that seems normal because a lot of people are getting fired at work.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like just really taking the time to be compassionate in the way that we are. I mean, not everybody is, but I think most people, when called upon, are compassionate towards each other. So taking that response that we would have for someone else, if you called me and you said you were going through this horribly stressful event and you were feeling so anxious, I wouldn't say, get over it.
Chill out.
You know what I mean? And if I did, you would never call me again.
Not helpful.
Not helpful. But I would probably say something like, that makes complete sense. Of course you're anxious. This is really stressful. So I think that's starting with curiosity and really giving to yourself.
Yeah, that self-acceptance. And I think a big piece of that is getting honest with yourself as well, to being able to accept the emotions that are coming through, that we are all human and it does come up. So.
Lilli, do you have a sense of heart rate variability and how that might play into working through trauma?
Heart rate
variability?
I can make assumptions. I know heart disease is very common in people who have suffered trauma. So,
Gotcha.
When you're frightened, when a tiger is chasing you, you're going to have your heart rate's going to speed up. It's not different when you feel like your life is in danger. If it only makes sense that if I feel like my life is at risk, that it's going to demand a lot from my heart. And if I now get triggered and the trigger makes me feel afraid for my life, even in situations that don't make sense, it's still putting that same demand on my heart. So while I can't specifically speak to heart rate variability, I can say that it makes perfect sense. I think there's so many of our organs that are impacted, honestly, and that stress is inflammatory in nature and can create inflammatory disease. You see a lot of autoimmune disease in individuals with trauma, as well as diabetes, which is autoimmune. You see heart disease and other types of things are very common in people with prolonged stress.
Interesting. Yeah. Earlier, I think you alluded to or outright mentioned using breath, just breathing. Is that a pretty well accepted process to help calm down your nervous system and bring you back to, activate your parasympathetic nervous system?
There are so many coping strategies that I've just come into recently. But I do think that there is a tendency when we feel stressed to hold our breath or to breathe shallowly, like we only get so much. And so from that standpoint, it does reground. It absolutely can. It can reground. I'm not going to say that every person who's feeling that fight or flight, if they do deep breaths, will get completely, normalized through that. But absolutely, it definitely does help you to stabilize and kind of come into a place of really being able to problem solve a little more of that prefrontal cortex engagement, and being able to move through it more wisely. I think the other thing I was thinking about with the breath too is just taking a sensory check on what's going on in your body.
Yeah.
And being able to kind of release some of that a bit also can be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So if a person is working through their trauma on their own, following online through a book, and they come face to face with their raw emotions, maybe they can't really handle it. What's the best place for them to turn to support?
Well, in the immediacy, I would say to somebody support, if they have a family member or friend, obviously that's a good place to start. But I think when you go and see somebody who is using the evidence-based practices for counseling, whether it be internal family systems, EMDR, we hear a lot about somatic experiencing. There's even yoga for trauma. And the epigenetic stuff where they're incorporating in some of that core language and doing some healing through some language there. I think all of that is very, very helpful. And anytime I've felt like I'm going through something too stressful and I'm kind of on overwhelm, that's a really great place to start, is to kind of engage with somebody and feel comfortable knowing that if you don't feel safe, comfortable, regarded, whatever by the therapist, fire them and move on as quickly as possible. You don't need
your health.
Yeah, exactly.
You're in control, right? Maybe it's just me, but what I've witnessed over my lifetime is so many people give away their power to their medical team or their medical professionals, assuming that they know they have the knowledge, they know what's going on. And I think that's a misconception. And I think that, people need to take back their power here when it comes to their selves, right? Their mental health, their physical health.
Yeah. They need a voice. You sound like a trauma-informed care provider.
I've gone through training, but no, it was not an area of focus. But yes, I've gone through some training with a different company that I used to train for. Well, thank you so much for taking the time and describing and walking us through this very important and very sometimes delicate subject, right? Because it's not easy. It's uncomfortable, or can be uncomfortable. Where can people go to find out more about your book and the work that you do in the world? Because this is important.
Thank you. I actually have a website. It's www.resolvetorise.com. So they can go to my website. There is an opportunity to connect if they want to contact me, if they have questions. I'll also do a free consult, but they can ask questions anytime via email. And I'm really excited to be able to start partnering up too with some people who are thinking about this and as passionate, about the topic like you guys.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for taking the time. We appreciate you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both.
Friends, if you found the Fierce Planet Adventures podcast helpful, please consider leaving a 5-star review on iTunes or your podcast platform of choice. It helps others find our podcast.
If you screenshot your review and tag us on Instagram, we'll send you a classic Fierce Planet Adventures sticker. For your water bottle, cooler, car, send us a direct message with your mailing address on Instagram, and we'll send you that sticker right out.
Thanks for joining us, and live fiercely.